The icy Han River water crashed over Zara Thompson's head as she fought against the current, her lungs screaming for air while her fingers clawed desperately at the submerged car door. Through the murky darkness, she could see him slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from his forehead into the rapidly rising water. Time was running out. 3 hours earlier, Zara had been sipping her third cup of coffee at the Riverside Cafe, watching Seoul's evening traffic crawl along the waterfront highway. The October storm had rolled in faster than the weather reports predicted, turning the gentle rain into a torrential downpour that sent pedestrians scrambling for shelter. She had been documenting every moment of her solo vacation for her travel blog, but now she found herself mesmerized by the dramatic transformation of the city under the storm clouds. The neon signs reflected off the wet pavement like scattered jewels, and she wondered if anyone back home in Atlanta would believe how beautiful this place could be even in the chaos. I'm curious where you're watching this from tonight. Have you ever found yourself in a foreign place during a storm, feeling both terrified and exhilarated at the same time? Comment below and let me know what city or state you're in, because there's something magical about experiencing weather in a place that's not your own. The sound that shattered her peaceful observation was like thunder, but wrong. Too sharp, too immediate. Zara's head snapped toward the highway just in time to see the sleek black sedan careening through the guardrail, its headlights cutting wild arcs through the rain before disappearing into the dark water with a splash that seemed impossibly loud over the storm. For a moment that felt like eternity, Zara stared at the spot where the car had vanished. Other cafe patrons were pointing and shouting in Korean, their voices rising in panic, but their words seemed distant and muffled. The car was sinking fast, and she could see the faint glow of its interior lights growing dimmer beneath the surface. Without conscious thought, Zara's chair crashed backward as she bolted from the cafe. The October air bit into her skin as she sprinted toward the river, her sneakers slipping on the rain-slicked embankment. Behind her, she could hear people yelling, probably telling her to stop, to wait for help, but there wasn't time. The car was already mostly submerged, and she could see the driver's silhouette still motionless inside. The first shock of the river water nearly sent her into cardiac arrest. The cold was so intense it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 needles simultaneously. Her body wanted to retreat, to gasp and thrash back to shore, but she forced herself to dive deeper. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, trying to sweep her downstream, but she fought against it with every stroke. Swimming had never been her strongest skill. Growing up in inner-city Atlanta, she had learned in community center pools during the summer, but nothing had prepared her for this. The river fought her like a living thing, pulling at her clothes and hair, filling her mouth with muddy water that tasted of urban runoff and fear. When she finally reached the car, it was almost completely submerged. Only the roof remained above water, and even that was disappearing fast. She gulped a deep breath and dove down to the driver's side window. Through the glass, she could see him clearly now. Asian features, expensive suit, probably in his 30s. His eyes were closed, and a thin stream of blood was drifting from a cut on his forehead like crimson silk in the water. The door was locked, or maybe just stuck from the pressure. Zara surfaced, gasped for air, and dove again. This time she used her elbow to strike the window. The first impact sent pain shooting up her arm. The second created a spiderweb of cracks. The third finally shattered the glass, sending shards swirling around her like deadly confetti. Water rushed into the car's interior with violent force, but she managed to grab him before the current could sweep him away. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight in the water, and for a terrifying moment, she wasn't sure she could get them both to the surface. Her lungs were burning when they finally broke through. She gasped and choked, struggling to keep his head above water while treading frantically. The shore seemed impossibly far away, and her strength was already failing. The cold was making her muscles seize up, and each stroke towards safety required more effort than she had left to give. Somehow she made it. Later, she would never remember exactly how she managed to drag him onto the muddy riverbank. Emergency responders were already arriving, their sirens cutting through the storm as paramedics rushed toward them with equipment and urgent Korean commands she couldn't understand. As they worked on him, checking his pulse and breathing, preparing to load him into the ambulance, Zara sat on the wet ground shivering uncontrollably. A police officer wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and tried to communicate in broken English, asking for her identification and what she had witnessed. Her passport identified her as Zara Thompson, age 28, from Atlanta, Georgia. Occupation listed as digital marketing consultant, which didn't seem particularly relevant now. The officer seemed surprised that an American tourist had been the one to attempt the rescue, but he was patient with her limited Korean and her shock-induced confusion. It wasn't until they were loading the unconscious man into the ambulance that someone mentioned his name, Park Jin-woo. Even through her exhaustion and adrenaline crash, Zara recognized the reaction that name produced in everyone around them. Suddenly, there were more police officers, more official-looking people in expensive coats talking rapidly into phones. She learned later that Park Jin-woo was the 34-year-old CEO of Park Industries, one of South Korea's largest tech conglomerates. His family's name was plastered on buildings throughout Seoul, and his personal net worth was measured in billions. The realization hit her as she sat in the back of the police car, still wrapped in that emergency blanket, that she had just pulled one of the most powerful men in the country out of the Han River. At the hospital, she gave her statement to Detective Kim, a woman in her 40s who spoke excellent English and seemed genuinely concerned about Zara's well-being. The questions were straightforward. What had she seen? What time had the accident occurred? Had she noticed anything suspicious about the vehicle before it went into the water? Zara answered as best she could, but the truth was that everything had happened so fast. One moment, she was observing the storm. The next, she was underwater trying to save a stranger's life. The detective assured her that her quick thinking had almost certainly saved Park Jin-woo's life, and that she should expect contact from his family once he was stable. Hours later, as Zara sat in the hospital waiting room in borrowed scrubs, a nurse appeared and gestured for her to follow. Park Jin-woo had briefly regained consciousness and was asking to see the woman who had rescued him. The intensive care unit was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft whisper of ventilation systems. When Zara approached his bedside, Park Jin-woo's eyes were open, though clearly struggling against the effects of medication and trauma. His gaze found hers immediately, and something passed between them that she would never be able to fully explain. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. The nurse leaned closer to listen, then looked up at Zara with an expression of surprise. "He wants to know your name," the nurse translated, "and he says to tell you that he owes you his life." Before Zara could respond, his eyes closed again as the doctors moved her away from the bed. The surgery to address his internal injuries would take several hours, they explained, and there was nothing more she could do tonight. As she finally made her way back to her hotel in the early hours of the morning, Zara couldn't shake the memory of that moment when their eyes had met. There had been something in his expression beyond gratitude, something that suggested this encounter had changed more than just the trajectory of his evening. She had no idea that Park Jin-woo never forgot a debt, and that saving his life had just bound their fates together in ways that would transform both of their worlds forever. The first thing Park Jin-woo saw when he opened his eyes was his father's disapproving face hovering over the hospital bed. Park Myung-soo's expression carried the same cold disappointment that had haunted Jin-woo's childhood. The look that said weakness was unacceptable regardless of circumstances. "You should have been more careful," his father said without preamble, not bothering with questions about pain or recovery. "The board meeting with the Singapore investors has been postponed. This incident will cost us millions." Jin-woo tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. The memories came flooding back in fragments. The storm, his car spinning out of control, the crushing impact with the guardrail, then the terrifying sensation of sinking into dark water. But there was something else, something that made his heart race despite the sedatives still flowing through his fore. The woman, the stranger who had risked her own life to save his. "Where is she?" Jin-woo asked, his voice still hoarse from the breathing tube they had removed that morning. "The American woman who pulled me out." His father's frown deepened. "That is being handled. Our legal team is preparing the appropriate compensation and non-disclosure agreements. She will be properly thanked and sent home." "No." Jin-woo's response was sharper than intended, causing his father to raise an eyebrow in surprise. "I need to see her myself." Over the next 2 days, as Jin-woo recovered enough to leave the intensive care unit, He had his head of security conduct a thorough investigation into his rescuer's identity. The woman was Zara Thompson, a digital marketing consultant from Atlanta who was in Seoul on a solo vacation. She had been staying at the Riverside Hotel, documenting her travels for a personal blog that had maybe a few hundred followers. The details painted a picture of someone completely ordinary and yet extraordinary. She had no swimming instructor certification, no lifeguard training, no particular reason to believe she could save anyone from a sinking car. She had simply seen someone in danger and acted without hesitation. What troubled Jean Woo more than his physical injuries was the growing realization of what this meant. In Korean culture, the concept of life debt was not merely symbolic. When someone saved your life, you became responsible for their well-being indefinitely. It was an obligation that transcended social class, nationality, or personal preference. His father had always taught him that obligation was weakness, that accepting help made you vulnerable to manipulation. Park Myung-soo had built his empire by owing nothing to anyone, by maintaining absolute control over every relationship and transaction. But this was different. This debt could not be managed or negotiated away. On Thursday morning, Jean Woo learned that Zara Thompson was scheduled to depart Seoul that afternoon. She had not contacted his family, had not requested any reward or recognition, had not even inquired about his condition. She was simply planning to leave as quietly as she had arrived, apparently content to disappear from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. This was unacceptable. Against his doctor's orders and his father's explicit instructions, Jean Woo discharged himself from the hospital and had his driver take him directly to the Riverside Hotel. His assistant, Choi Min-jun, sat beside him in the car reviewing the cultural protocol that would govern this encounter. "Sir, you understand that by formally declaring life debt to a foreigner, you are creating a situation that cannot be easily resolved," Min-jun said carefully. "Your father will not approve of this approach." "My father's approval is irrelevant," Jean Woo replied, adjusting his tie despite the persistent ache in his ribs. Some obligations transcend business considerations. They found Zara in the hotel lobby, sitting beside a single piece of rolling luggage and checking her phone with the focused attention of someone trying to avoid thinking about something important. She was smaller than he had remembered from their brief moment in the hospital, but there was something in her posture that suggested strength held in reserve. When she looked up and saw him approaching, her expression shifted through surprise, concern, and something that might have been irritation. She stood up, unconsciously straightening her shoulders as if preparing for a confrontation. "Mr. Park," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that made his name sound softer than he was used to hearing it. "You should still be in the hospital." "Miss Thompson," he replied, offering a slight bow that made her eyes widen. "I came to speak with you before your departure." "There's nothing to discuss," she said quickly, glancing around the lobby as if looking for an escape route. "I'm glad you're recovering, but I don't need anything from you. What I did was just basic human decency." Jean Woo felt something tighten in his chest at her dismissive tone. In his world, people treated his presence like an audience with royalty. They prepared for meetings with him weeks in advance, dressed in their finest clothes, brought gifts and elaborate presentations. This woman was treating him like an inconvenience. "You do not understand," he said, maintaining his formal tone despite her casual rejection. "In our culture, when someone saves a life, it creates an obligation that cannot be ignored." "Well, in my culture," Zara replied, "we help people because it's the right thing to do, not because we want something in return. I don't need your money or your gratitude. I just need to catch my flight." Min-jun stepped forward, sensing the conversation was not progressing as his employer had anticipated. "Miss Thompson," he said in careful English, "perhaps I can explain the concept more clearly. In Korea, life debt is not about payment. It is about honor and responsibility." Zara turned her attention to the assistant, and Jean Woo found himself oddly jealous of Min-jun's ability to capture her focus. Her eyes were darker than he had noticed before, almost black in the hotel's warm lighting, and they held an intelligence that seemed to evaluate everything around her with startling accuracy. "I understand that you have cultural traditions," she said to Min-jun while pointedly not looking at Jean Woo. "But I'm not Korean, and I don't want to be part of anyone's sense of obligation. I did what anyone would do in that situation." "That is where you are wrong," Jean Woo said, his voice carrying enough authority that both Zara and Min Jun turned to face him completely. Not everyone would have acted as you did. Most people would have waited for professional help, would have prioritized their own safety, would have assumed someone else would handle the situation. He took a step closer, noticing how she held her ground despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. You risked your life for a complete stranger without knowing who I was or whether I deserved saving. That kind of courage deserves recognition, whether you want it or not. What it deserves, Zara said, her voice rising slightly, is to be left alone. I don't want recognition, I don't want money, and I definitely don't want to be anyone's obligation. I want to go home. Your flight has been delayed, Min Jun interjected, consulting his phone. Weather problems at Incheon. All departures postponed until tomorrow morning. The frustrated sound that escaped Zara's throat was somewhere between a laugh and a groan. Of course it has, she muttered, sinking back into her lobby chair. This whole trip has been one unexpected thing after another. Jin-woo felt a surge of something he couldn't quite identify. Relief, perhaps, that their conversation would not be cut short. Or satisfaction that fate seemed to be conspiring to keep her in Seoul a little longer. Since you will be staying another night, he said, his tone becoming less formal, perhaps you would allow me to buy you dinner. Not as obligation, but as gratitude. Zara looked up at him with an expression that suggested she was trying to solve a particularly complicated puzzle. You nearly died 3 days ago, she said. Shouldn't you be resting? I have been resting, he replied, and for the first time since approaching her, he allowed himself a small smile. I am told that mild activity is part of recovery. She studied his face for a long moment, and Jin-woo found himself holding his breath waiting for her response. There was something in her eyes that suggested she was seeing him differently now, not as the powerful CEO who commanded respect and fear, but as the man who had almost drowned in the Han River. One dinner, she said finally. But after that, we're even. No life debt, no ongoing obligation, no cultural traditions that bind us together. Agreed? Jin-woo nodded, though something deep in his chest suggested that one dinner would never be enough to settle the debt between them. Some obligations, he was beginning to understand, transcended cultural boundaries and personal preferences, creating connections that could not be easily severed. As they arranged to meet that evening, neither of them noticed the small group of reporters who had gathered outside the hotel, cameras ready to capture the first images of the mysterious American woman who had saved one of Korea's most powerful men. Zara woke to the sound of camera shutters clicking outside her hotel room window. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but as consciousness fully returned, she realized the sound was real and persistent. When she peered through the curtains, her stomach dropped at the sight of at least a dozen photographers gathered on the sidewalk below, their telephoto lenses pointed directly at her floor. Her phone had been buzzing constantly since dawn, but she had ignored it, assuming it was just her mother checking on her trip. Now she saw 43 missed calls from unknown Korean numbers, 17 voicemails, and a flood of text messages in both English and Korean. The most recent message was from a number she recognized as Min Jun, Jin-woo's assistant. Do not leave your room. We are coming to get you. The story has gone international. The story, as Zara discovered when she finally worked up the courage to check social media, was everywhere. Dramatic tourist saves Korean CEO had been trending on Twitter for 6 hours. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, with various news outlets describing her as everything from a hero to a gold digger who had staged the entire rescue for attention. The photos they were using had clearly been taken without her knowledge. Someone had captured the moment she dragged Jin-woo from the river, both of them soaked and desperate. Another showed her sitting in the police car wrapped in an emergency blanket, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. A third, which made her cringe, was apparently from yesterday's hotel lobby encounter, with Jin-woo bowing to her while she looked skeptical and annoyed. The speculation in the comments was brutal. Half the people were calling her a hero, the other half were questioning her motives for saving a billionaire. Several articles had already dug into her background, publishing details about her job, her apartment in Atlanta, even her college graduation photo. When the knock came at her door, she was relieved to see Min Jun's face through the peephole, accompanied by 2 men in dark suits who were obviously security personnel. Miss Thompson, Min Jun said as soon as she opened the door, we need to move you immediately. The situation downstairs is becoming unmanageable. What situation? Zara asked, though the continuous sound of camera shutters provided a pretty clear answer. Approximately 50 journalists have gathered in the lobby and outside the building. One of the security men explained in heavily accented English. They are demanding interviews and blocking other hotel guests. I didn't ask for any of this, Zara said, grabbing her suitcase and the few belongings she had scattered around the room. I just want to go home. Mr. Park anticipated that you would say that. Min Jun replied with what might have been sympathy. Your flight this morning has been canceled due to the media attention. The airport situation is even worse than here. Zara's heart sank as they escorted her toward the service elevator. Through the windows, she could see the crowd of reporters and photographers had grown even larger, with news vans lining the street and what appeared to be live television broadcasts being conducted from the sidewalk. The escape from the hotel felt like a scene from an action movie. They exited through the kitchen loading dock, where a black SUV with tinted windows was waiting. Even so, several persistent photographers managed to get shots of her climbing into the vehicle, their camera flashes creating a disorienting strobe effect. During the drive through Seoul's morning traffic, Zara tried to process the surreal turn her vacation had taken. 4 days ago, she had been an anonymous tourist taking photos of street food and temple architecture. Now she was apparently the subject of international news coverage, fleeing paparazzi in a convoy of luxury vehicles. Mr. Park's residence has a private security system, Min Jun explained as they drove through increasingly affluent neighborhoods. You will be safe there until we can arrange alternative transportation home. I don't want to impose on him, Zara said, watching the city pass by through the darkened windows. He's still recovering, and this is not his responsibility. With respect, Miss Thompson, Min Jun replied, Mr. Park considers your safety to be exactly his responsibility. The media attention is a direct result of your association with him. Jean Wu's house was not what Zara had expected. Instead of the ostentatious mansion she had imagined, it was a sleek, modern structure built into the side of a hill overlooking the Han River. The architecture was all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows, giving the impression of floating above the city rather than being part of it. The interior was even more surprising. Despite the obvious expense of everything from the imported marble floors to the contemporary art hanging on the walls, the space felt almost empty. There were no family photos, no personal mementos, nothing that suggested the house was actually lived in rather than merely occupied. Jean Wu was waiting in the main living area, dressed casually in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that made him look younger and less intimidating than he had in his hospital bed or business suit. When he saw her, his expression shifted from concern to something that might have been relief. I apologize for the circumstances that brought you here, he said, gesturing toward the wall of windows that offered a panoramic view of Seoul. This was not the outcome I intended when I asked you to dinner. None of this is your fault, Zara replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed that. The media would have found out about the rescue eventually, right? Jean Wu's slight grimace suggested otherwise. My family's publicity team may have been overzealous in managing the story, he admitted. They intended to control the narrative, but instead they created more interest. So this is all because you wanted to thank me properly, Zara said, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. Your cultural obligation has turned my life upside down. Yes, Jean Wu said simply, and something in his directness made her anger deflate slightly. I take full responsibility for that. The housekeeper, an older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Lee, showed Zara to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment back in Atlanta. The room had its own sitting area, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub, and a private terrace that looked out over the river. It was beautiful and luxurious and completely overwhelming. When she returned to the main living area an hour later, Jean Wu was standing at the windows with a tablet in his hand, scrolling through what appeared to be news coverage. His expression was grim. How bad is it? Zara asked, joining him at the window. The Korean coverage is respectful, he said, handing her the tablet. The international stories are more sensationalized. Zara scrolled through headlines that made her cringe. Mystery woman saves Korean billionaire, became romantic rescue in Seoul, became American tourist life-saving kiss, with CEO. The photos accompanying the articles were getting more dramatic with each retelling, and several outlets were speculating about a secret relationship between them. "They're making it sound like some kind of fairy tale romance," she said, handing the tablet back to him. "Is that so terrible?" Jean Wu asked, and when she looked up at him in surprise, she realized he was closer than she had expected. Close enough that she could see the small scar on his forehead where he had hit the steering wheel. Close enough to notice that his eyes were not quite black, but a very dark brown with gold flecks. "Yes," she said, though her voice came out quieter than intended. "It's terrible because it's not true. We're strangers who met under extreme circumstances. There's no romance here, just obligation and inconvenience." Jean Wu studied her face for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable. "You are right. Of course," he said finally. "I apologize for the presumption." The awkwardness of the moment was broken by Mrs. Li announcing that dinner was ready. Jean Wu had arranged for them to eat on the terrace, where the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. The meal was simple but elegant: grilled fish, steamed vegetables, rice prepared with a delicacy that made every grain perfect. As they ate, Jean Wu asked about her life in Atlanta, her work, her reasons for traveling to Seoul alone. Zara found herself talking more freely than she had expected, describing her job managing social media campaigns for small businesses, her tiny apartment in Virginia Highland, her decision to take this trip as a gift to herself after ending a relationship that had been going nowhere for 3 years. "You ended it because you wanted to travel?" Jean Wu asked. "I ended it because I realized I was more excited about going to Korea alone than I had ever been about anything we did together," she said, surprising herself with the honesty. That seemed like a pretty clear sign that we wanted different things from life. "And what do you want?" he asked. Zara paused with her chopsticks halfway to her mouth. "I want to feel like I'm actually living instead of just going through the motions," she said. "I want to have experiences that change me, even if they're scary or uncomfortable. Like rescuing strangers from sinking cars," Jean Wu suggested with the hint of a smile. "That wasn't planned," she laughed. "That was pure impulse. I usually overthink everything, but something about that moment just required action." As the evening progressed, Jean Wu told her about his own life, though in more guarded terms. He described the pressure of inheriting responsibility for thousands of employees, the isolation that came with his position, the way every decision he made affected not just his own future, but the livelihoods of entire families. "Do you have anyone?" Zara asked. "Family, friends, someone you can just be yourself with?" "My father sees me as the heir to his legacy," Jean Wu said after a long pause. "My colleagues see me as their employer. My social circle sees me as a networking opportunity. I am not sure I remember who I am when no one is watching." The vulnerability in his voice caught Zara off guard. This was not the confident CEO who had approached her in the hotel lobby, but someone much younger and lonelier than she had imagined possible. Their conversation was interrupted by Min Jun appearing on the terrace with an urgent expression. "Sir," he said, approaching the table carefully, "we have a problem." The problem, as it turned out, was that several photographers had somehow tracked them to the residence and were currently positioned outside the main gate, telephoto lenses trained on the terrace where they had been dining. Security was working to remove them, but not before they had captured images of Jean Wu and Zara sharing what appeared to be an intimate dinner. Jean Wu's transformation was immediate and striking. The vulnerable man who had been sharing his loneliness disappeared, replaced by someone harder and more commanding. He issued rapid instructions to Min Jun in Korean, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone around him move faster. "Pack your things," he told Zara as they moved inside. "We are leaving for the country house tonight." "You have another house?" she asked, trying to process how quickly their peaceful evening had been shattered. "I have several," he replied, already heading toward what appeared to be his home office. "And after tonight's photos surface, you will need to stay away from public view until we can arrange secure transportation home." As Zara returned to the guest room to gather her belongings, she caught a glimpse of herself in the full-length mirror. Her reflection showed a woman who looked excited rather than frightened, energized by the drama rather than exhausted by it. The realization troubled her almost as much as the photographers outside the gate. She was supposed to want to escape this situation, to return to her quiet life in Atlanta where no one took her picture without permission and dinner was never interrupted by security concerns. But as she listened to Jin Woo coordinating their departure with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management, she found herself wondering what the country house would be like, and how much longer she could reasonably extend her stay in his complicated world. The country house was a traditional Korean estate hidden in the mountains 2 hours outside Seoul, with curved roof lines and stone walls that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. Jin Woo had been silent during most of the drive, responding to a constant stream of phone calls in rapid Korean, while Zara watched the city lights fade into darkness through bulletproof glass. They arrived near midnight, and despite her exhaustion, Zara found the house breathtaking. Paper lanterns illuminated walkways through carefully manicured gardens, and the sound of a small waterfall provided a peaceful soundtrack that felt worlds away from the chaos they had left behind. "Your room overlooks the bamboo grove," Jin Woo said as Mrs. Lee, who had somehow arrived ahead of them, led Zara through sliding doors and polished wood hallways. "I hope you will find it restful." But rest was the last thing on Jin Woo's mind. As soon as Zara was settled, he retreated to his study with his head of security, Kang Hyun-soo, for a conversation that had been postponed too long. The older man's expression was grave as he spread photographs and documents across the mahogany desk. The brake lines were severed, Kang said without preamble, pointing to close-up images of Jin Woo's destroyed sedan. "Professional job, designed to look like mechanical failure during adverse weather conditions." Jin Woo felt something cold settle in his stomach as he studied the evidence. When he asked, "Sometime between when you left the office and when you stopped for dinner downtown," Kang replied, "which means someone with access to the parking garage. Someone who knew your schedule." The implications hit Jin Woo like a physical blow. The parking garage at Park Industries had multiple security checkpoints, key card access, and surveillance cameras monitoring every entrance. Only employees with the highest clearance levels could move freely through that area. "Who knew I would be dining in that district?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer would make him sick. "Your assistant, your driver, your father, and the 3 board members you met with that afternoon," Kang said, consulting his notes. "Plus anyone they might have told." Jin Woo stared at the photographs, trying to process the reality that someone in his inner circle had tried to kill him. The crash that had nearly taken his life, the terrifying moments underwater, Zara's desperate rescue attempt. All of it had been orchestrated by someone he trusted. "There is more," Kang continued reluctantly. "The investigation into Ms. Thompson's background revealed something interesting. Her presence at that riverside cafe was not entirely coincidental." Jin Woo's head snapped up, a surge of betrayal making his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "She had been dining at restaurants in that area for 3 consecutive evenings," Kang explained. "Always alone, always positioned with a clear view of the street. Her hotel concierge confirms she specifically requested recommendations for places with river views." The implication was clear, and it made Jin Woo feel nauseous. Zara had not stumbled upon his accident by chance. She had been watching, waiting, possibly even coordinating with whoever had sabotaged his car. But then Kang handed him another set of documents, and Jin Woo's understanding shifted completely. "Her travel blog posts from those 3 days," Kang said. She was documenting the local food scene. 23 restaurants visited, 47 photos posted, detailed reviews of everything from street vendors to Michelin-starred establishments. She is what she appears to be, a tourist with an interest in Korean cuisine. The relief Jin Woo felt was so intense, it left him dizzy. Zara's presence at the Riverside Cafe had been genuine coincidence, her rescue attempt purely instinctive. She had not been part of the conspiracy against him, which makes her current situation even more dangerous, Kang continued. "Whoever orchestrated the assassination attempt now knows that she saved your life. They will view her as either a witness or an asset." Jin Woo was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the full scope of the threat. Someone close to him had tried to kill him, and now that same person might target Zara simply because she had interfered with their plan. "Double the security detail," he instructed finally. "And I want complete background checks on everyone with garage access, starting with the people who knew my schedule that day." "Sir," Kang said carefully, "that includes your father." Jin Woo met his security chief's eyes steadily. "I am aware of what it includes." After Kang left, Jin Woo sat alone in his study, staring out at the moonlit gardens while trying to make sense of the betrayal. His relationship with his father had always been complicated, built more on duty and expectation than affection. But the idea that Park Myung-soo would orchestrate his son's death seemed impossible. Unless, of course, his father had decided that Jin-woo was no longer the right heir to lead the family empire. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his dark thoughts. Zara stood in the doorway wearing pajamas she must have borrowed from Mrs. Lee, her hair loose around her shoulders and her expression concerned. "I heard voices," she said. "Is everything okay?" Jin-woo realized he had been sitting in darkness for over an hour, and that Zara looked like she had been trying to sleep without success. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She settled into the leather armchair, tucking her feet under her with an unconscious grace that made something in his chest tighten. "I keep thinking about what you said at dinner," she said. "About not knowing who you are when no one is watching." "What about it?" he asked. "Right now, no one is watching except me," she said simply. "So who are you?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jin-woo found himself wanting to answer honestly in a way that surprised him. "I am someone who has just learned that one of the few people I trust tried to kill me," he said finally. Zara's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "The car accident was not an accident," Jin-woo explained, watching her face as understanding dawned. "Someone severed my brake lines. Someone who knew my schedule and had access to my car." Zara was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "So when I pulled you out of that river," she said slowly, "I was saving you from murder, not just mechanical failure." "Yes," Jin-woo confirmed. "And now that person knows you interfered with their plan." The color drained from Zara's face. "You think they might come after me?" "I think you are safest here, under my protection, until we identify who is responsible," Jin-woo said. "But I understand if you want to leave immediately. I can arrange for you to return to Atlanta tomorrow with a security escort." Zara stood up abruptly and began pacing the length of the study. "This is insane," she said. "I came here to eat good food and visit temples. I didn't sign up to be part of some corporate assassination plot." "You did not sign up for any of this," Jin-woo agreed. "Which is why I am giving you the choice to leave." But even as he said it, the thought of her returning to Atlanta while someone wanted her dead made his stomach clench with anxiety he did not want to examine too closely. "Who do you think it is?" Zara asked, stopping her pacing to look at him directly. Jin-woo hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. "The investigation points to someone close to me," he said. "Someone who knows my routines intimately." "Family?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Possibly," Jin-woo admitted, and saying it aloud made something break open in his chest. "I have spent my entire life trying to earn my father's approval, trying to prove I was worthy of inheriting his legacy. The idea that he might have decided I was a liability instead is—" He could not finish the sentence. Zara moved closer, her expression full of compassion that he did not deserve. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I cannot imagine how that must feel." "It feels like drowning," Jin-woo said, surprised by his own honesty. "It feels like being underwater in that car all over again. Except this time, there is no rescue coming." Without thinking, Zara reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the desk. The contact was electric, sending warmth up his arm and making his breathing shallow. "You rescued yourself that night," she said. "You survived the crash. You stayed conscious long enough for me to find you. You held your breath until I could get you out. I may have done the swimming, but you saved your own life." Jin-woo stared down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt to have her touching him. "When did you become so wise?" he asked. "When I decided to take a vacation by myself in a country where I don't speak the language," she replied with a small smile. "Turns out solo travel teaches you things about yourself you never knew." Their moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the house. Jin-woo was on his feet instantly, his training from years of security protocols taking over. He grabbed Zara's hand and pulled her away from the windows, pressing her against the wall beside the doorway. "Stay behind me," he whispered, listening for any sound that might indicate where the intruder was located. But before they could move, Kang's voice came through Jin-woo's earpiece, urgent and professional. "Sir, we have multiple vehicles approaching the main gate. Armed personnel. This is not a random break-in." Jin-woo felt his blood turn to ice. Someone had found them, despite all the security measures and the isolated location. The assassination attempt was continuing, and now Zara was directly in the line of fire. "We are leaving," he told her, grabbing a go-bag from his desk drawer and leading her toward a concealed door she had not noticed before. Now, the hidden passage led to an underground garage where a motorcycle was kept for exactly this type of emergency. As they descended the stairs, Jin-Woo could hear gunshots in the distance and the sound of his security team engaging the attackers. "Get on," he commanded, throwing a helmet at Zara and starting the engine. "I don't know how to ride a motorcycle," she protested, but she was already swinging her leg over the seat behind him. "Just hold on to me," he said, "and do not let go no matter what happens." As they roared out of the hidden garage and into the mountain night, Zara's arms wrapped around his waist with desperate strength. Behind them, the traditional house was illuminated by muzzle flashes and the beams of tactical flashlights as the attack continued. Jin-Woo drove like he was racing death itself, taking turns that made the motorcycle lean at impossible angles while Zara pressed against his back. The mountain roads were narrow and treacherous, but he knew them from years of escaping to this house when the pressures of Seoul became too much. 20 minutes later, they arrived at a small cabin hidden even deeper in the mountains, a place so remote that even Kong did not know about it. Only when they were safely inside with the door locked behind them did Jin-Woo allow himself to process what had just happened. Someone had found them within hours of their arrival at the country house. Someone with resources, planning, and a determination to see him dead that went far beyond normal business rivalry. And now Zara was trapped in the middle of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The mountain cabin was smaller than the guest bathroom at Jin-Woo's city house, with rough-hewn walls and furniture that looked like it had been built by hand decades ago. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the single bedroom was separated from the main living area by nothing more than a curtain hanging from wooden beams. Zara sat on the narrow couch, still wearing Mrs. Lee's borrowed pajamas and processing the reality that they had just fled gunmen in the middle of the night. Her hands were shaking, whether from cold or adrenaline or delayed shock, she could not tell. Jin-Woo moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking windows, securing locks, testing the landline phone that was their only communication with the outside world. His movements were controlled and precise, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought she was not watching. "Kong will send a cleanup crew to the house," he said, finally settling into the chair across from her. "We should be safe here until morning." "Safe," Zara repeated, tasting the word like it was foreign. "Is that what this is?" Jin-Woo looked at her sharply, perhaps hearing the note of hysteria that was creeping into her voice. "You are safe," he said firmly. "I will not let anyone hurt you." "That's not what I mean," Zara said, standing up abruptly and beginning to pace the small space. "Safe would be being back in Atlanta in my boring apartment with my boring job, not hiding in a mountain cabin from people who want to kill us." "You could be back in Atlanta tomorrow if you choose," Jin-Woo said quietly. "I can arrange transport that bypasses all commercial flights." Zara stopped pacing and stared at him. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of wind through the pine trees outside. When Jin-Woo finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "What I want is irrelevant," he said. "What matters is your safety and your choice." "No," Zara said, moving to stand directly in front of his chair. "What you want is absolutely relevant. I have been making choices based on what I think you need, what your culture expects, what will cause the least trouble. But I have no idea what you actually want from me." Jin-Woo looked up at her, and she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression that made her breath catch. "I want you to stay," he said simply. "Not because of obligation or cultural debt or gratitude. I want you to stay because the thought of you leaving feels like drowning all over again." The confession hung in the air between them, and Zara felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that they had crossed into territory from which there might be no return. "Jin-Woo," she said softly, but he stood up, bringing them close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I know it is selfish," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask you to stay in a world that has become dangerous because of me. But these past few days with you have been the first time in years that I have felt like a person instead of just a position." Zara reached up, her fingers tracing the scar on his forehead where he had hit the steering wheel during the crash. "You are a person," she said. You are brave and protective and lonelier than anyone should have to be. When he kissed her, it was with a desperation that spoke of too many years of emotional isolation and too many recent brushes with death. She kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands tangling in his hair while his arms pulled her against him as if he was afraid she might disappear. They made their way to the bedroom without breaking contact, a stumbling dance of hands and mouths, and whispered reassurances that this was what they both wanted. The narrow bed was barely large enough for two people, but neither of them cared about comfort when they had finally found connection. Afterward, they lay tangled together under a quilt that smelled of cedar and mountain air, Zara's head on Jin Woo's chest, while his fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'm scared," she admitted in the darkness. "Of the people trying to hurt us," he asked. "Of losing myself," she said. "Of caring about you so much that I forget who I am when I'm not with you." Jin Woo was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling on her shoulder. "I have the same fear," he said finally. "I have spent my entire life being controlled by other people's expectations. I do not want to control you in the same way." "Then don't," Zara said, lifting her head to look at him. "Whatever this becomes between us, it has to be a choice we keep making, not an obligation." They were interrupted by the sound of Jin Woo's satellite phone ringing from the main room. He reluctantly extracted himself from their embrace and answered, speaking in rapid Korean while Zara pulled on clothes. When he returned to the bedroom, his expression was grim. "Kong has identified the traitor," he said. "It was not my father." Zara felt a wave of relief on his behalf. "Who is it?" "My cousin," Jin Woo said, his voice flat with betrayal. "Park Sung-min. He has been feeding information to a consortium of competitors who want to break up our company and divide the assets." The name meant nothing to Zara, but she could see the pain in Jin Woo's eyes. "Someone you trusted," she said. "Someone I grew up with," Jin Woo corrected. "Someone I considered a brother. He has been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment to eliminate me and position himself as the natural successor to lead the family business." "What happens now?" Zara asked. "Now he knows that his first attempt failed and that I am aware of his betrayal," Jin Woo said. "Which means he will try to finish what he started, and he will use any leverage he can find." As if summoned by his words, Jin Woo's phone rang again. This time, when he answered, Zara could hear a different voice speaking Korean on the other end, followed by Jin Woo's sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" she asked when he hung up. "Sung-min has taken my father hostage," Jin Woo said, his voice carefully controlled. "He wants to meet with me in 2 hours to discuss terms for a peaceful transition of power." "You can't go," Zara said immediately. "It's obviously a trap." "Of course it is a trap," Jin Woo agreed. "But he has my father, which means I have no choice." Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Take me with you," she said. "Absolutely not," Jin Woo replied. "You will stay here where you are safe." "If I stay here," Zara said, moving to stand in front of him again, "then I'm just a loose end for him to tie up later. But if I'm with you, at least we face whatever comes together." Jin Woo cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I cannot lose you," he said. "Not now." "Then don't lose me," Zara replied. "Trust me to be strong enough to handle this." The meeting location was an abandoned warehouse complex on the outskirts of Seoul, the kind of place where sounds did not carry and bodies could disappear without questions. As they approached in Jin Woo's backup vehicle, Zara could see multiple cars already positioned around the building. "Stay in the car," Jin Woo instructed as they parked. "If anything goes wrong, drive away and call Kong." But Zara was already opening her door. "We do this together or not at all," she said, and something in her tone made him realize that arguing would be futile. Park Sung-min was waiting inside the warehouse with 6 armed men and Jin Woo's father, who was seated in a chair with his hands zip-tied behind his back. Despite his restraints, Park Myung-soo looked more angry than frightened, his expression promising retribution for this indignity. "Cousin," Sung-min said as Jin Woo and Zara entered the warehouse. "I was hoping you would bring your American pet. It makes this negotiation so much simpler." "What do you want?" Jin Woo asked, positioning himself slightly in front of Zara. "I want what should have been mine from the beginning," Sung-min replied. "Leadership of this family, control of the company, and recognition as the rightful heir to grandfather's legacy." "You tried to kill me for a corporate promotion," Jin Woo said, his voice carrying a mixture of disgust and disbelief. I tried to eliminate an obstacle, Sung Min corrected. You were always father's favorite, always the chosen successor, despite having no real vision for the future. I have spent years developing relationships with international partners who could take our business global, but you and uncle were too traditional to see the opportunities. So you decided to murder your way to the top, Zara said, speaking for the first time since entering the warehouse. Sung Min's attention shifted to her with predatory interest. The heroic American, he said, do you have any idea what your interference has cost me? Months of planning, millions in preparation, all ruined because you decided to play lifeguard. I'm sorry your murder plot was inconvenienced by basic human decency, Zara replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm that made several of Sung Min's men shift nervously. Sung Min laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You have spirit, he said. I can see why my cousin is so attached. It will make this even more effective. Before anyone could react, two of Sung Min's men grabbed Zara, pinning her arms while a third pressed a gun to her temple. Jin Woo took a step forward, but froze when he realized any sudden movement could get her killed. Here are my terms, Sung Min said, his voice becoming coldly businesslike. You will sign documents transferring controlling interest in Park Industries to me. You will publicly announce your retirement due to health concerns from your recent accident, and you will disappear permanently, along with your father and your American friend. And if I refuse, Jin Woo asked. Then I kill her first, Sung Min said, gesturing toward Zara. Then your father. Then you. But at least this way, you have the opportunity to save their lives by sacrificing your own. Jin Woo looked at Zara, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also a determination that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her courage. She gave him the slightest nod, a signal that she trusted him to find a way out of this. I need guarantees, Jin Woo said, his mind racing through possibilities. How do I know you will honor your agreement once I sign? You don't, Sung Min admitted. But you also don't have any other options. That was when Zara made her move. She had been testing the grip of the men holding her, and when one of them relaxed slightly, she stomped down on his instep while throwing her elbow back into the other's solar plexus. The gun went wide as she broke free, diving toward a stack of shipping containers for cover. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Jin Woo tackled the gunman nearest to his father, while Sung Min shouted orders to his remaining men. Bullets ricocheted off concrete and metal as everyone scrambled for position. Zara found herself pinned behind a container, listening to the firefight and trying to figure out how to help. That was when she saw Jin Woo moving to flank Sung Min's position, exposing himself to crossfire in order to reach his cousin. She realized with crystalline clarity that he was going to get himself killed trying to end this personally, and she could not let that happen. So she did the only thing she could think of. She created a distraction by running directly towards Sung Min's position, drawing the gunfire toward herself and away from Jin Woo. The plan worked, but the cost was higher than she had anticipated. Jin Woo reached Sung Min just as one of the remaining gunmen got a clear shot at Zara's exposed position. Jin Woo threw himself in front of the bullet meant for her, taking the impact in his shoulder and spinning him around before he hit the ground. Zara's scream of his name echoed through the warehouse as she reached him, pressing her hands against the spreading blood while Jin Woo struggled to remain conscious. Around them, the sound of sirens indicated that Kang's backup had finally arrived, but all Zara could focus on was keeping the man she loved alive until the paramedics could take over. This time, she was the one racing against time to save him, and the desperation she felt made her understand exactly what he had meant about drowning. Losing him now would be like losing the ability to breathe. Jin Woo's recovery was slower this time, complicated by infection and the emotional trauma of his cousin's betrayal. For 3 weeks, Zara rarely left his hospital room, working remotely on her laptop while he drifted in and out of consciousness, her presence a constant anchor in his medicated dreams. When he finally woke fully, the first thing he saw was her sleeping in the chair beside his bed, her head pillowed on her arms and her hair falling across her face like a curtain. The sight made something tight in his chest finally relax. "You stayed," he said softly, and she jerked awake with the startled expression of someone who had been sleeping lightly for weeks. "Where else would I go?" she replied, reaching immediately to check his forehead for fever. "How do you feel?" "Like I was shot," he said with a weak smile. "But alive, thanks to you." The doctors had told him about her quick thinking in the warehouse, how she had maintained pressure on his wound and kept him conscious during the ambulance ride. They credited her actions with saving his life, which meant their rescue count was now even. Sung Min was in custody, along with his co-conspirators, facing charges that would keep them imprisoned for decades. The investigation had revealed the full scope of the plot, including bribes to security personnel and plans to frame Jin Woo's death as a tragic accident during his recovery from the car crash. Most surprising of all, Park Myung-soo had used his son's hospitalization to undergo his own transformation. Jin Woo's father visited daily, bringing reports about the company restructuring and asking for Zara's opinions on decisions with a respect that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. "She saved your life twice," the older man had told his son during one visit. "That makes her family, regardless of nationality or tradition." As Jin Woo's strength returned, Zara faced the decision she had been postponing for weeks. Her original vacation time was long expired. Her job was understanding but not indefinitely patient, and her visa would require renewal if she stayed much longer. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted one evening as they sat on the hospital balcony watching Seoul's lights twinkle in the distance. "I don't know how to go back to my old life, but I don't know how to build a new one either." Jin Woo took her hand, his thumb tracing the small scar she now carried from broken glass in the warehouse. "What would you want to build?" he asked, if there were no practical limitations. Zara was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. "Something meaningful," she said finally. "Something that uses what I've learned about connecting across cultures, about finding common ground when everything seems impossible." Jin Woo smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "I might have some ideas about that." 3 months later, Zara was living in Seoul and working as the cultural liaison for Park Industries' new international expansion program. Her job involved bridging communication gaps between Korean executives and their American partners, using her unique perspective to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that could destroy business relationships. The work was challenging and fulfilling in ways her previous job had never been. She was learning Korean with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself, and discovering that she had an intuitive gift for reading the subtle cultural cues that could make or break international negotiations. Meeting Jin Woo's extended family had been an exercise in navigating expectations and assumptions. Some relatives had been openly skeptical of their relationship, questioning whether an American could ever truly understand Korean values. Others had been overly enthusiastic, treating her like an exotic curiosity rather than a person. But gradually, through shared meals and patient conversations and her obvious dedication to understanding their culture, she had found her place in the complex network of relationships that defined Jin Woo's world. The moment that had truly won over his grandmother came during a family dinner when Zara had quietly helped serve the elders and then insisted on helping clean up afterward, despite being a guest. The gesture had communicated respect in a language that transcended words. "You chose well," grandmother had told Jin Woo afterward in Korean, not knowing that Zara was beginning to understand more than she let on. "She has a strong heart and proper manners." Jin Woo's own transformation was equally profound. The brush with death and betrayal had forced him to examine his priorities and relationships with new clarity. He had restructured the company's leadership to prevent future concentration of power, implemented new security protocols, and begun developing more democratic decision-making processes. More importantly, he had learned to balance his professional responsibilities with his personal happiness. He left work at reasonable hours, took actual weekends off, and had begun talking about his feelings instead of assuming that stoic silence was strength. The change was not lost on his employees, who whispered that the CEO who had returned from his injuries was somehow more approachable, more creative, more willing to listen to ideas from unexpected sources. 1 year after the warehouse confrontation, Jin Woo took Zara to the Han River on an evening that deliberately echoed their first meeting. They sat at the same riverside cafe where she had been drinking coffee during the storm, watching the water reflect the city lights. "I have been thinking about debts," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone that always signaled an important conversation. Zara looked at him with concern. We settled that debt a long time ago. No, Jinwoo said, taking her hands in both of his. I mean the debt I owe to the universe for bringing you into my life at exactly the moment when I needed to remember what it meant to be human. He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, and Zara felt her breath catch as he opened it to reveal a ring that was nothing like what she would have expected. Instead of a traditional diamond, it held a stone that seemed to capture the colors of water, shifting between blue and green and silver as it caught the light. This is aquamarine, he explained. The stone of courage and protection. I had it set according to both Korean and American traditions, so it honors where we both come from while creating something entirely new. Zara stared at the ring, then at Jinwoo's face, seeing nervousness and hope and love in his expression. Is this a proposal? She asked. This is a choice, he replied. The choice to build a life together that respects both of our cultures, while creating space for us to become who we are meant to be as a couple. The choice to save each other every day in all the small ways that matter. Yes, she said before he could finish the speech he had obviously prepared. Yes to all of it. The wedding 6 months later was a masterpiece of cultural fusion that somehow honored both traditions while feeling authentically theirs. The ceremony began with Korean customs, including the paybeak, where Zara formally greeted Jinwoo's parents and received their blessing. She wore a traditional hanbok in deep blue silk, her hair arranged in the classical style with ornaments of jade and silver. But the vows they exchanged were written in both languages, and the reception included music from both cultures, food that represented their shared journey, and a guest list that spanned continents. Zara's family had flown in from Atlanta, bringing southern warmth and barbecue recipes that somehow paired perfectly with Korean side dishes. The moment that brought tears to everyone's eyes came when Jinwoo's grandmother presented Zara with a family heirloom, a bracelet that had been passed down through 6 generations of Park women. You are our daughter now, she said in careful English, her words carrying the weight of acceptance that could not be negotiated or demanded, only earned. 2 years later, Zara stood in the Park Industries boardroom presenting a proposal to expand their cultural liaison program across all of the company's international partnerships. Her Korean was now fluent enough that she could conduct the entire meeting without translation, though she still preferred to think through complex ideas in English. Jinwoo watched from his seat at the head of the conference table, his expression carefully professional but his eyes warm with pride. She had become not just his wife, but his true partner in business, bringing perspectives and insights that had transformed how the company approached global relationships. Their marriage had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined during those first chaotic weeks. They challenged each other professionally, supported each other emotionally, and had created a relationship dynamic that felt both stable and continuously growing. The question of children came up occasionally, usually prompted by family gatherings where cousins displayed their offspring with obvious expectation. But for now, they were content building their partnership and exploring the ways their different backgrounds created unexpected strengths when combined. On quiet evenings, they often returned to the Riverside Cafe where their story had begun. Sometimes they talked about business, sometimes about family, sometimes about the places they wanted to travel together. But always, they remembered the storm that had changed both of their lives. I used to think courage was about not being afraid, Zara said during one of these visits, watching the Han River flow past their window table. But I've learned that real courage is being terrified and acting anyway. Jinwoo reached across the table to touch the aquamarine engagement ring she still wore alongside her wedding band. You taught me that, he said. You showed me that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to trust a stranger. Their story had become something of a legend in Seoul, the American tourist and Korean CEO, whose dramatic rescue had led to an unlikely romance. But for them, the real magic was not in the dramatic beginning, but in the daily choice to keep choosing each other. I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll share your answer in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed your life, where you had to choose between playing it safe and taking a leap into the unknown? Maybe it was moving to a new country, starting a relationship with someone from a different culture, or just trusting your instincts when everything seemed impossible. I'd love to hear about the moments that defined your own story, because I think we all have more courage than we realize. As they walked home through Seoul's bright streets, hand in hand and comfortable in the silence between them. Both Zara and Jean Wu understood that their greatest rescue had not been the dramatic moment in the river. It had been the gradual, daily work of saving each other from the isolation and fear that had defined their separate lives. They had learned that love was not about owing someone a debt that could never be repaid. It was about choosing, every morning, to be the kind of person worth being chosen by someone extraordinary. And in the end, they had both discovered that the most profound transformations come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet courage to remain open to possibilities, even when those possibilities arrive in the form of a stranger diving into dark water to pull you toward the light.